for Visual Culture's Royal College of Art Postgraduate Research Workshop. My name is Judith Meddick and I'm an Honorary Research Associate in the Department of Languages, Literatures and Cultures at Royal Holloway. Last time we were virtually based at the Royal College of Art, and today we go back up the river to Egham, where the baton passes to James Williams, Professor of French, Francophone Cinema and Literature, as well as Director of the Centre for Visual Cultures at Royal Holloway. James is going to moderate this session.
Thank you, Judith, and thank you for passing on the baton from Teal. And this is our second, and I hope, one of many collaborations with the Royal College of Art. I'm going to keep my words brief so we can make a start on the presentations. And just to say this then, the session is being recorded and the presenters will give their approval. If that's the case, then we can put it on our website and share that link with everyone. And we're going to be slightly different this time in that we'll have all the four presentations before we open it up to questions. If there are questions, please put them in the chat if you have them. If anything sort of strikes you as very urgent, perhaps clarification in a presentation, we can pick that up immediately. But if we put everything in the chat, then we can come back at the end of the fourth presentation and address the questions. Okay, I'm going to ask everyone, please, who's not presenting to turn off their camera. Our presentations then begin first with Polly Hember, then we have Amina Abbas-Nazari from the RCA, Caroline Harris from CVC and Royal Holloway, and then Laurence from the RCA. But we begin then with Polly, I'm not going to give you biographical details, Polly, because that's already in the publicity. So I'll simply pass over to you, Polly.
Thank you so much, James. I'm just going to quickly share my screen and get my slides up. And just let me know if anyone has an issue with that. But everyone should be able to see that in full screen. Is that all right?
All good.
Wonderful. Well, yes, but yes, just to say again, thank you, James, and thank you to everyone for joining, and to the organisers for just such a wonderful opportunity to discuss this work, which comes from my doctoral thesis, which I've just recently submitted, and also for the opportunity to get to hear about everyone else's research later on. It's just a pleasure to be a part of this event. So I guess I'll just dive in and start us off. So what we can see here is the December 1929 cover of the film magazine Photoplay, which depicts a portrait of the silent cinema star Norma Talmadge, whose career was one of many that dwindled during the shift to synchronized sound technology in films, where we can kind of see, just cut off there with my presentation, the microphone, the terror of the studios. And I'll be thinking through what this means today in my presentation. So indeed, kind of following the first talkie, The Jazz Singer, which debuted in 1927, the role of sound in cinema was a topic of fraught discussion and was met with some horror and some hostility, much of which was documented by film critics at the time. And my paper looks today at the narrative around sound cinema that was constructed by film writers in the late 1920s, tracing the cultural reception to the dawn of the talkies and its tentatively hopeful vision for the future of cinema. I do this by looking at a largely forgotten and critically neglected book called Admin Evelyn at Kew Gardens, or Revolt in the Gardens, by a film writer and literary modernist called Robert Herring, who we can see waving at us here. So Robert Herring exists as a decidedly minor figure in both in terms of histories of film and in terms of histories of literary modernism. And his fiction has received nearly no critical attention to date. And the reason I'm so interested in Herring is because of his connections to a group of writers and filmmakers called the Pool Group, whose experiments exist as a sort of prototypical and critical archive of modernist film. Herring was one of the central contributors to the Paul Group's film journal Close Up, which we can see here on the right, which ran from 1927 to 1933. In Close Up's first issue, the editor Kenneth Macpherson referred to their historical moment as a critical age. Indeed, the group spanned the tense transition between silent cinema and the talkies, launching just 3 months before the Jazz Singers' debut in 1927, which established both the dominance of Hollywood's production and also the dominance of sound technology. So Herring's fiction, I argue, narrates and expands on many of the debates found in the pages of Close Up, that film journal, engaging with the inter-arts exchange between literature, film, and modernist cultures. Indeed, Close Up is often characterised by its hostility towards sound, where many of the writers felt sound ruined the universal, pure language that silent film possessed. Ian Christie defining the journal as the rearguard defence of aesthetics of silent art cinema. However, commentary within Close Up, and especially regarding sound film, rarely functioned cohesively or consistently. As recent research has explored, Close Up acted not just as this homogenous opposition to the talkies, but rather as a site of debate and conjecture. So Tim Armstrong has described the journal as a snapshot of modernist uncertainty, where Close Up's initial scrutiny actually gives way to an uneven and even a latent excitement surrounding the possibilities of film. So the debate in and around film art and the future of this medium that evolved throughout Close Up is, I argue, distilled in Adam and Evelyn at Kew. So Herring's book is a parody. It's really weird and wacky. It's set over the course of one day in London's Kew Gardens, which Herring doubles as the Garden of Eden, recasting the fall of man as a parable of modernity. The narrative follows Adam, who was ruled by an authoritarian and godly curator, and Adam kind of by chance meets the star of a new sound film, who he names Evelyn, who is also on the run from her all-powerful and jealous director. So this book was written between 1926 and 1930, and it kind of functions as a non-linear amalgamation of Herring's contrasting views about cinema and about sound technology in cinema specifically, where Herring's reservations and his tentative optimism for film's future are presented through Evelyn's journey throughout Kew Gardens over the course of this one day. So Evelyn in this book is described as a modern girl. Herring says she was made by her director, who, on hearing her voice, proclaimed that girl must be synchronized. She brings new knowledge to the garden about film's existence. So Adam was not aware of film's existence prior to her emergence in the garden. She brings new knowledge about sound technology, and she also questions Adam's ideas about language. Within this modernist allegory that Herring creates, I therefore suggest that Evelyn operates as a symbol for film art, allowing Herring to explore his ideas about film art's future. So Evelyn herself is very suspicious of sound technology in film, expressing her distaste for microphones as she explains their function to Adam. She says, "It's not quite a person, it's that thing that takes up everything we say. I wish they had never been allowed in." And within Herring's parody, sound technology is linked to original sin. Instead of devilish serpents that speak to Eve in the garden, as in the book of Genesis, it is the sound actress Evelyn who talks to the temperamental microphones, or mics as she calls them, whilst filming on set at Kew, which she describes as, quote, perfect devils to manage. Adam takes her comment quite literally and believes she has been talking, quote, of nothing less familiar than the devil. However, as with Close Up and that kind of the debate and conjecture in those pages, Herring's depiction of sound technology is far more complex than a straightforward biblical dichotomy of good and evil. Symbols are contorted throughout the narrative, developing an uncertain and ambivalent commentary about the future of film and sound's place within that. So just as sound technology is one of the many forces that shaped British film production in the late 1920s, the devilish mics are actually the least of Evelyn's concerns in Herring's warped garden. As the narrative progresses, Herring shows Adam to be the greatest threat to Evelyn, and therefore film's future. Within his role as Kew's gardener, Adam maintains order and tradition. He has been taught by his great power to curate and not to create. Herring positions Evelyn as a catalyst for change. Her intrusion into the text incites the text revolt which kind of speaks to another text that was going around about at this time. So Virginia Woolf's famous essay on the cinema argues that film took much of its inspiration from literature and other arts at this time. She says it was like a gardener mowing the lawn, where film operated more like a parasite than of its own volition. And Herring uses similar horticultural imagery here to speculate on how film might be able to grow and develop uninhibited by what has come before, away from Adam's neat flower beds and walkways. His investment in preserving order is exemplified by a disagreement with Evelyn as they imagine how the tree of knowledge might look like. Adam gestures to a tree growing close to a cluster of statues in the garden, which Evelyn challenges. So we have a little quote here. She asks him whether he imagines the tree of knowledge to look like this because it's by those statues. She says, no, that's not a tree of heaven. It was a shoot of hell, sown in paradise. She looked up from the feather-tipped branches. This isn't a pear, is it? She asks. I think the tree of knowledge must be a pear because that's the only fruit like a question mark. For though it isn't a tree at all, really it's the imagination prompting how and why. The fruit it produces at every turn is a branch or a query, pear-shaped, upside down. Can't you see it? She asks Adam. So Adam's conception of knowledge here is associated with statues, an insignia for the preservation of the past, which Evelyn dismisses as the shoot of hell. The tree, instead of her imagination, forgoes the traditional image of an apple and turns the symbol quite literally upside down, pear-shaped. Whereas the apple is sort of shaped like a blunt full stop here that would halt a sentence, a question mark shaped pear calls for more. So for Evelyn, we see that knowledge is constituted by curiosity and experiment as boughs full of hanging questions orientated towards uncertainty and plurality. This directly contrasts Adam's worldview, which becomes increasingly oppressive and controlling as the narrative goes on, and is related over and over again to these statues and this idea of a singular knowledge, absolutism, and ideas that are inherited from the past. So thus, Herring's extended metaphor in Adam and Evelyn Act Q can be seen to outwardly critique sound technology as the devil, but this transpires not to be a terror so much as seen on the cover of Photoplay in that first slide, but as a humorous joke which informs Adam's inability to understand and comprehend Evelyn's life and her wantonness to experiment. So the more insidious danger in Herring's parody is exposed to be Adam and his controlling ideas of tradition and order that actively oppose Evelyn's autonomy, where she is trapped with him in the garden with no escape at the end. Adam directly silences Evelyn by talking over her time and time again, where she calls this the very worst of Adam. And he eclipses her vision as she confronts him later in the text, just before they are trapped in the garden. She says, I think you are only interested in yourself. You wanted to assert yourself, to stand between me and the light so that I only would see you. These concerns about cinema are depicted through this odd, really and sprawling parody, which seek to narrativize Herring's more traditional critique in the pages of Close Up, which are very straightforward film reviews. So what he does here is experiments with across different mediums to ask, with those pear-shaped questions, what the future of cinema might look and what it might sound like. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Polly, and thank you so much for keeping to the time so beautifully. We really appreciate it. That's a great start. I've got lots of questions I'd like to ask, but I'm going to keep them for the moment. And we move on to our second presenter then, and that is Amina Abbas-Nazari, Royal College of Art. Hi, Amina.
Hi.
And
thank you very much. So yeah, thank you everyone for having me. It's wonderful to be here, and yes, thank you to the Royal Holloway team for having me. So my name is Amina. I'm a speculative designer, researcher and vocal performer studying in School of Communication at RCA. Quite often communication departments in art and design settings are prefixed by the word visual, but actually for this presentation I'm going to try something a bit different. It's going to be purely audio based, or actually voice based. As with the nature of my PhD, this presentation is vococentric, a term by Cheon 1994 from Film and Cinema Studies that means to privilege the voice over other audiovisual media. This presentation will give you a brief overview of some of my PhD research practice and its core themes, accompanied by some audio recordings.
Alexa, add wrapping paper to the shopping list.
I've put wrapping paper on your shopping list.
Alexa, how many teaspoons are in a tablespoon?
1 tablespoon equals 3 teaspoons.
Okay. Alexa, set a timer for 8 minutes.
8 minutes, starting now.
So my PhD research is a practice-led investigation of the sound and sounding of voices, both human and synthesized in artificially intelligent conversational systems, such as human voice interaction with an Amazon Echo device voiced by Alexa, which you just heard. I am particularly interested in how the sounding of these voices is comprehended to then shape the ways in which we understand human-computer interactions and notions of identity and being, which I'm going to expand on in this talk.
The sounds as they appear to you are not only different from those that are really present, but they sometimes behave so strangely as to seem quite impossible. But they sometimes behave so strangely, 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 sometimes behave so strangely.
Professor of Psychology Diana Deutsch shows us how the repetition of a recorded segment of speech becomes song in her speech-to-song illusion experiment. As you probably noticed, there becomes a point where sonic effect overrides linguistic comprehension of the words, as we trace the melodic nature of the phrase being spoken. Laurence Abu-Hamdan describes in the practice of forensic listening, where spoken words become sonic specimens, allowing for analysis of vocal sound in the assessment of a person's character, behavior, and identity. In Abu-Hamdan's doctoral thesis, he recounts an interview with a forensic linguist who describes, "Last week, a colleague and I spent 3 working days listening to one word from a police interview tape." Here we see the repetition of a recorded and captured voice allows for vocal profiling and assessment. This is equally true of the voice identification and analysis in conversational AI systems. As Kang 2022 notes, this industry relies on an understanding of the voice as fixed, extractable, and a measurable sound object located within the body. This ideology maintains the idea that people only have one voice and that someone's voice can give a full picture of that individual. The above examples describe how this is possible of the extracted, recorded, and captured voice, whereby in AI-related examples, machine listening replaces the labor of the human forensic listener. There is a growing body of literature about how to apply AI to analyzing voice to determine wide-ranging factors about an individual, including age, hormone levels, heart rate and blood pressure, and behavioral parameters such as dominance, leadership, and public and private behavior. These practices of profiling rely on normative and stereotypical representations of humans that cause real-world harm to people, especially those who are already marginalized within society. We can trace the origins of these practices to the field of phonetics, which sees voice sounds as a diagnostic index of age, health, energy level, emotional state, regional origin, or ethnicity. In reality, though, the sound and sounding of an unextracted or embodied voice is never fixed. Recorded on the hour over an 11-hour period of a day, I tried to replicate the voicing of the "sometimes behave so strangely" phrase.
Sometimes behave so strangely. 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 Sometimes behave so strangely.
There was a failure to maintain the aspired consistency of the speech-to-song experiment in which Deutsch repeated the phrase through means of editing with technology. In the logic of AI's practices of profiling afforded by machine listening, The machinic desire is to zoom in and measure each utterance contained within the sometimes behaves so strangely phrase, to read and fully comprehend the articulated sonics of my voice. Perhaps I was heard to say the phrase louder and faster as a result of a caffeine intake, or perhaps my voice became deepened in pitch, signifying I was tired. However, from the perspective of sounding, as opposed to listening, the embodied sounded voice always evades the capture of the listener, human or machine, through its ever-dynamic materiality. I believe this position can give voices increased authority and autonomy within conversational AI systems. As a trained singer with particular interest in extended and experimental vocal technique, I align my understanding of voice with singer and musicologist Nina-san Eidsham. Writing in 2019, she describes how a specific voice's sonic potentiality in its execution can exceed imagination, and voices as having an infinity of unrealized manifestations. By understanding the voice as material and as having materiality, it is no longer singular, stable, or consistent, but it can morph, shapeshift, and have polyphonic potential. In my work, I argue that female experimental vocal practitioners evidence this. Kathy Barbarian, who you just heard, was the pioneer of extended vocal technique. She would work with her voice to produce many voices and many sounds, often imitating animals, cartoon characters, or sound effects. Barbarian used her voice to disrupt the way she was expected to perform, be seen and identified. Female experimental vocal practitioners actively uncouple their voice in relation to identity and defy normative assumptions of how they are expected to sound. I was interested to explore and articulate the vocal potential exhibited in the embodied materiality of voices. This was in order to challenge assumptions projected onto people by AI, and indeed the AI industry, of the voice as fixed, extractable, and measurable, to defy this reference point for the measuring and profiling of a person. The following clip is from a project produced as part of my PhD research called Polyphonic Embodiments. In the work, I used DIY devices made from simple materials to modify my voice and exaggerate its materiality.
They had no fixed values to be altered by adjectives and adverbs. He was pressing the other limit. They had no fixed values to be altered by adjectives and adverbs. He was pressing the other limits of his. They had no fixed values to be altered by adjectives and adverbs. He was pressing beyond the limits of his. They had no fixed values to be altered by adjectives and adverbs. He was pressing beyond the limits of his. They had no fixed values to be altered by adjectives and adverbs. He was pressing beyond the limits of his. They had no fixed values to be altered by adjectives and adverbs. He was pressing beyond the limits of his. They had no fixed values to be altered by adjectives and adverbs. He was pressing beyond the limits of his. They had no fixed values to be altered by adjectives and adverbs. He was pressing beyond the limits of his. They had no fixed values to be altered by adjectives and adverbs. He was pressing beyond the limits of his. They had no fixed values to be altered by adjectives and adverbs. He was pressing beyond the limits of his.
As the project title suggests, the work invites people to consider the multidimensional nature of voice and vocal identity from an embodied standpoint. Through my artistic practice-led research, I hope to evolve and augment discussion around how the sounding of voices is comprehended by different disciplines of research. Taking a standpoint from music and design practice, I believe this can contest ways of working in the realms of AI-mediated communication and shape the ways we understand notions of vocal identity as complex, fluid, and malleable. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amina. That was very interesting indeed. Obviously, lots of immediate themes there about the voice, plurivocity, plurivocality, the fears, the dangers, perceived dangers of that, and potential. So we are very interesting during our discussion, perhaps, to make some links back with Polly's work on Herring and that period of cinema. But we move on now to our third presenter then, that's Caroline Harris, here from Royal Holloway. And I just want to say, my apologies, Caroline, I didn't put the fact that on the Eventbrite, that's your image from the Deer project, deer as in the animal deer. So we did it on the internal publicity, but not on the Eventbrite. So sorry about that, that's now rectified. Over to you.
Thank you very much, James. Thank you everyone here today for this opportunity to present about my work. I'm just going to share my slides if I can. Okay, can everyone see that all right?
All good.
Lovely. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about deer collars, and I've given it the subtitle Cuteness, Breaking and Amending. Deer collars is a project from my poetic practice PhD. The overall thesis is entitled Awestruck Poetics, as in AWW, Deer and Poems as Cute Objects. So I'm going to start by giving some context to my research and talking about why cuteness matters in relation to non-human beings and poetry. And I'll then give a brief overview of some aspects of the creative process in this project and how I've been looking at ways to develop the Deer Collars project further. So the focus of my research is on the poetics of deer, in particular in relation to the emerging field of cute studies. My interdisciplinary thesis asks how a post-human or perhaps dehuman poetics of cuteness might critique, subvert and refigure attitudes towards deer, both as living beings and as literary subjects. It contributes to the emerging field of cute studies, for example, by working towards a definition of non-human cuteness that recognizes the specificity of the cute relationship with non-human persons, such as deer. I'm using experimental poetic practice and theoretical discussion to explore what might constitute not only a cute poetic content and materials in poetry, but cute procedures, forms, and production. Poems I'm looking at include the medieval epic, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, but also works by contemporary poets, including Joy Harjo, Alice Oswald, and Pascal Petit. So as you can see on this slide, some of the questions I'm considering in my work are, what is cuteness in relation to non-human beings? Also, what do poets do when they put deer in poems? How are deer used and represented in poetry? What relevance does cuteness have for poetry, and what might constitute a cute poetics? What are some of the problematics, but also what are the generative and positive potentials? And also, as I was saying, how might a cute poetics critique, subvert, and transform both literary representations and human attitudes towards real deer? So on this slide as well, the image shows my artist book, Cut Out Bambi, which is a response to watching the 1942 Disney film Bambi for the first time, and also to Pascal Petit's poem Bandaged Bambi. It aims to highlight how for humans deer are both cute but also very killable by literally cutting out the deer from YouTube images. So why does cuteness matter in relation to non-human animals? So this reel, which shows how beavers carry their young in their arms, came into my Instagram feed just this morning. So I thought I'd pop it into the presentation. The cute is often dismissed as frivolous and trivial, as anthropocentric and anthropomorphizing. It's associated with kitten and beaver memes, rainbow unicorns, big-eyed Disney cartoon characters, and drawings in the Japanese kawaii style. But there are a number of reasons why cuteness and cute studies are important. Some scholars argue that cuteness should be treated seriously because of its economic and cultural power, particularly in the form of kawaii. Cute products have a huge global reach. Cuteness as a sensibility and style is, to quote, everywhere around us, as philosopher Simon May puts it in his book, The Power of Cute. Specifically, however, cuteness also shapes many interactions and relationships with non-human beings. The cute factor has driven the breeding of dogs and rabbits for particular features, and a number of these features are detrimental to their health. It also influences behaviours towards companion animals. Cuteness is engaged in charitable fundraising efforts and in promoting sympathy for and empathy with species. In our aesthetic categories, a landmark work in cute studies, Sayan Nai underlined the power relationships of cuteness, which she calls an aesthetic response to the diminutive, the weak, and the subordinate. So the cute is political. The initial source for my investigations into poetic cuteness is Nai's provocative application of cute aesthetics, not only to characters such as Hello Kitty, but to contemporary art and also to certain types of avant-garde poetry. Nai suggests that cuteness can be seen in the, to quote, short, thing-oriented poetry in the imagist and objectivist traditions of early Pound, Williams, and Oppen, and also in works such as Gertrude Stein's Tender Buttons. This challenges traditional views of the avant-garde, which, as Nai says, to quote, has historically defined itself in opposition to everything for which cuteness stands. I have been looking at processes in my creative practice that might be applied to poetry in order to cutify it, such as creating short stanzas or breaking down the syntax and sense by substituting letter groups with the cute expression, or. So this slide shows origami deer from my recent work, 7 Chimera Poems for Catch-all. My Deer Collars project involves a series of collars that have been cut out from scanned and printed pages taken from an edition of Felix Salton's Bambi, A Life in the Woods, and folded and then sewn into 4 different designs. I've then created a sequence of poems made from the remnants of language left on the paper formed into the physical deer collars. So it's a very material process. The piece forms part of my explorations of the subversive potential of textile cuteness and of breaking and amending. The concern with breaking and amending comes from my research into the poetic archive. So the medieval English poem Sir Gawain and the Green Knight includes an extended deer hunt scene and also recounts the ritualized butchering of the fattest deer after the hunt. This practice was known as breaking the deer, and it's shown here in the deer hunt tapestry from the series known as the Devonshire Hunting Tapestries. So it's not actually correct in terms of the chronology of what's being done here, but right at the front, you can see that the deer is being opened up and the guts are being fed and blood-soaked bread is being fed to the hounds. So after the hunt, each person or creature involved received their what was known as fee, in terms of meat from the deer. So thinking through the idea of breaking in relation to poetics has been generative for my own practice research, in which I have been breaking, cutting up and cutting into texts and images in a range of ways. This might be seen as a violent act, but a number of poets, such as Layli Long Soldier and Kate Siklosi, have erased or torn portions of texts or sewn together scraps in order, for example, to highlight marginalization, land theft, and the forced migration of Native Nations peoples. In her collection Leavings, which we've got some images from here, Siklosi includes a section entitled Amend, in which leaves, stems, and texts are sewn together. So this was part of my thinking in terms of this sewing. What can we do when we re-sew texts into different forms? For my own project, I've created a series of folded and sewn deer collars, each of which takes its inspiration from particular sources. I was interested, as this kind of search from Etsy shows, in how deer are often shown dressed up, often with necklaces, also in images on taxidermy deer heads. I also wanted, with the deer collars idea, to gesture towards deer tracking collars, which have themselves caused a number of fatalities. So I'm going to talk through some of the deer collars and the influences. So here you can see there's a deer with a necklace, and in the center a collar with, it's a kind of, on Etsy, they're kind of sold as cute S&M collars. So a collar with a pink heart, and also taxidermy deers, one wearing a pearl necklace with lace on it. And this influenced my first two deer collars, Lockhart and Mrs. B. Pearl. So Mrs. B. Pearl was the name given to the deer, the taxidermy deer in the previous image. Lockhart, here you can see that the sewing is rather in the style of a corset, and on the other side, which you can't see here, I've put a lock shape. So the third and fourth collars, the third one was particularly influenced by the Wilton diptych, which shows the white hart emblem of Richard II, with a crown around its neck and a chain hanging from it. And then the final deer collar tapestry was took its kind of buckle shape from deer tracking collars, but then also references the kind of the curlicues shown in the Devonshire tapestry. That's the kind of the very stylized form that the intestines take. So you can see on the left the crown shape of the white hart, and then you can see hanging down there the curlicues, which reference the intestines from the tapestry. So then, how does that relate to poetics? In a way, you could say that each of those collars is a poem in itself. But then, after cutting out, folding and stitching, I transcribed the words and fragments from each collar in sequence. I then went about combining the graphemes into words, phrases and lines, keeping them, though, in the order in which I read them from the paper collars. I was drawn to organising these fragments to look like poems, rather than scattering or exploding or layering the disassembled elements over the pages, as in works by experimental poets such as Susan Howe. However, these poems that I've made don't read like more traditional poems, and they are quite difficult. So, for example, reading from the beginning of Lockhart. Way off, but right head was completely grey now. His face was purr, and the bushes in the undergrowth, the flowers on hesitation or searchy, folded their red, white and yellow stars. On Bambi questioni 21512. Und into ithi him visidge, where timid, a is ins, a quev quesmin I primecta he was, of waspring the soms no entio first. This raises questions about the relationship between difficulty and cuteness. These poems do not read as cute. They are obscure and do not make sense in a kind of traditional way, even though they appear to be poetry. They are perhaps more like a form of asemic writing. referencing back to the last seminar, really. Oh, sorry, my screen's just gone blank. There we go. At present, I'm working through the composition of these difficult poems and the creative decisions I might take with them. One relationship that I'm considering in writing up my research is that between the awe, AWE, of the sublime and the awe, AWW, of cuteness. So you can see here on this slide, for one series of new works, I've created collages using iridescent ink, and in the center one, faux silver leaf, with pages cut from Felix Salton's Bambi. And these pages highlight some of the scenes of predation, hunting, and death. And then in the left-hand image, I've been sewing into these kind of icons, if you like, to see how thread might entangle more between text and material paper and words. I'm also looking to investigate how I might create an AR version of the deer collars that could be worn by humans, like a Snapchat filter. So anyone with suggestions about that, thoughts on collaboration, that would be very welcome. And finally, Textual Porosity is the group exhibition with Bryony Hughes and Astra Papachristodoulou, where a selection of the work in this presentation and other works are on show until the 11th of June. It's taking place near Hampton Court, and do visit us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Caroline. And it just occurs to me, maybe you could put that in the chat, the link to the gallery, so everyone has that. Yes, well, there are lots of ideas raised by your presentation, and the question also of AR, and Amina was talking about AI. Perhaps we can get onto that in our discussion. And everyone, please do put in the chat thoughts, questions you may have when we go into our discussion. So we move on to our final presentation then, which is from Jess Laurence. Tess Laurence, excuse me.
Hi, I'm just going to share my.
Okay.
That's
Yes.
fine. I'm just going to get up my PowerPoint. Sorry, I should on the start. And can everyone see that okay?
Yes, we can now.
Yes, that's sharing it.
Thank you.
That's great. I'm just going to check moving through. Okay, fantastic. Hello, everyone. As I said, my name is Tess Laurence, and I'm midway through my doctoral research at the Royal College of Art, entitled, it's practice-led research entitled Syntheses of Time. It's the application of animation practices to wordless picture book making for children. And the focus is the shape and structure of stories for children. My objective is to develop a methodology for wordless storytelling in print that emerges out of my experience as an animator and a lecturer in animation. My main question is, how can some of the creative and technical processes carried out in the production of short animated experimental narrative films augment and affect the form and structure of wordless picture books for children? And finally, the contribution is to provide picture book makers who prioritize text with a toolkit of practical methods drawn from animation practices to manage and control rhythm and the flow of time when constructing a wordless book. And the methodology is drawn from Henri Bergson's philosophy of time by way of animation theory and practice, which is then repurposed for wordless picture book making. It reconciles a tension between the material reality that moving images are made up of 24 frames a second and a philosophical perception of the moving image as a visual rendering of thought. And Henri Bergson famously hated film, so I rendered him here trapped inside the film strip. And I'm drawing from a particular section of short wordless animated films, not suitable for children, and independently published children's picture books that all share a common preoccupation with time and demonstrate radical and unpredictable forms of visual storytelling. But this evening, I'm just going to focus on my practice rather than the theory, which I've organized under 5 headings: structure, sequence, narrative, character, and production. And these headings move between the macro processes that engineer visual story writing and the micro processes I undertake to interrupt and atomize my picture book making. So beginning with structure, I'm going to start with this quote by the editor Walter Murch. The clickety-clack of the projector and the clickety-clack of the train are similar. I wonder if film would have been invented without the train, the invention of tracks and all that made us think a certain way about the world and led eventually to the idea of the sprocketed film with its frame lines. And I love how Murch uses the train to express the relationship between the physical nature of film and its poetry. But I'm also drawing from Rutensky's Tango, a film with many characters who appear to belong to different moments in time, but are squeezed into the same place. Like Tango, my story is fixed to a space, a train, which is unashamedly linear. But to structure a linear story, we need to work backwards into the past to make sense of the present. And it's a mistake to reduce linearity to the single track. For me, the challenge of linear storytelling is to get from A to B without knowledge of where B is, so to travel blindly. And drawing from Bergson and Deleuze, I've adopted 4 story shapes that collectively, contribute to the architecture of my final story as a system of narrative construction. So these are linear, cyclical, spiral, and rhizomatic. And I put together a series of bullet points that all relate to structure to design my story. So my story will occur through a moving train. It'll take place over 24 hours. It begins and ends on a platform. It's made up of 12 compartments, each carriage confined to a double page. The same characters appear in every compartment, and every compartment contains its own fixed narratives that are sealed within the space, but also form a chain of events that run through the book. And visual mapping is an integral part of my research, theory and practice. I knew I wanted the train to dominate the narrative and the storytelling, so I drew it as a sprocketed film strip across the page with characters and themes above. Once I'd worked out the order of these spaces, I could begin to construct story maps for each double page to break down the structure into discrete sections so each section could be assembled in isolation. These maps offer a space for experimentation and play, but also include preliminary illustrations I've begun to regard as early drafts for the final book. So the number 2 is sequence, juxtapositioning. I've been drawing out ideas, character designs, and rough layouts on paper from the outset. They're playful spaces to experiment with story ideas and images that can be stored, reworked, and returned to at a later date. Juxtapositioning these images into sequences in the grids is a macro process, so looking for rational and irrational or poetic linking. Many of these images were produced months, even years apart, but they all contribute to the same story. Using my maps, I began to lock down my list of characters, assigning each one a cyclical activity, and I would classify this as a micro process. The aim of these cyclical activities is to create a disruption in the inherent linearity of the book, to momentarily seal off every compartment where everything is governed by an unfolding circularity. I had a collection of birds, a reference to migration, marching undertakers in their coffin, a circularity of life and death. Once I fixed on these characters, I could begin to assemble or plot their stories as shapes. I had linear, the train, the cycle by way of repetition, so I then moved on to the spiral. The spiral can either follow an upward or a downward trajectory. At its center, it appears as a cycle where there are a few options. It's not until it opens up that it can break free from repetition, and there's an opportunity for change. Fiction is always speculative. We take a bet on what might happen, which is why some of my characters are seen to be either gambling, spiraling down, or predicting the future, such as the fortune teller there at the bottom and fortune-telling miracle fish. Adopting the shape of a board game, I mapped this spiral using train tracks and began to add objects and characters. I focused on how these different characters might interact across the spiral, where I would place them. At the center, there are fewer options, where I placed a missing cat, which escapes from its carrier for the duration of the story and quietly returns to it at the end. Placing a cat at the centre fixed that narrative thread, but as it opens out, there are more opportunities to follow alternatives. Which brings me to narrative. With so many characters to accommodate, I decided to produce a series of concertina books where I could plot the narrative progression of one character at a time. They're examples of simultaneous succession, where the same character is seen many times in different poses on the same page. As this character knits, I took the notion of linear threads literally and linked the figures together with wool. As their story progresses, she knits, it grows. The act of knitting repeats, but as the wool unravels, chaos ensues. So we have linear, cyclical, the wool forms a spiral, and she finds herself unable to control it. As the folds are visible, indicated here in blue, they segment the series into distinct sections. The images can be arranged so the folds benefit the composition, and the illustrations can be read as separate pages, as well as an uninterrupted flow. This boy discovers a yo-yo, which forms a spiral when it recoils and can be used as both a tool or a hazard in the wrong hands. Over the course of his story, he masters it, but not without creating havoc along the way. The line, the loop, the spiral, and the rhizome. Like tango, in isolation, these are very simple little stories, but together they make up a tapestry that weave through the book, each with its own duration. There are no main characters, but there are hierarchies and reversals of fortune, spiraling up and down. The admiral here begins wealthy and over the course of the journey loses everything. It plays out in reverse for the buskers. This character works on the train, an essential worker. And here, this image merges all the concertinas. Each character maintains a detached and overlapping duration. And this then brings me to animation. Character. Cycles are fundamental. Hopefully this is moving. Cycles are fundamental to animation, evolved out of the zoetrope where every narrative has to be cyclical. The animated short has an imminent relationship to repetition and the variations that allow for change. It's a linear progression that folds back on itself. But with so much of our daily life characterized by cyclical repetitions, it's also an essential part of learning. Repetition to assist understanding. Repetition can provide a picture book with a particular rhythm. It can also provide a useful delay in the narrative or inject humor into the story. The anticipation of a repeat can be very powerful, as we cannot be certain of its reoccurrence. As with the concertina books, I would take a selection of characters in isolation and animate their assigned activity as a cycle. With subjecting the characters to the weight, tension, and pressure of time away from illustrating the book, change the progression of each story and how each character is integrated onto each page. It was a reflective exercise. I was distracted away from the storytelling and locked into the fundamentals of animation process. How many frames would the action require and how limited for the effect I wanted? I had to split the body onto separate layers, you can see here, so the hands could pass in front of the ball while the body remained behind. Where would I position the character to ensure the whole body would fit inside the frame at all times? There were creative questions such as color and texture. But once the animation was finally exported, I could reflect upon the creative value of the experience. I'd not considered that the egg could be a living creature until I'd animated it. These looping GIFs represent instances in the story that I could pause, make thick and sticky, to paraphrase Batkin, holding on to the moment for as long as I needed before I released it back into the book. And finally, production. Picture book making. This final stage brings together all the practical experiments supported by the theoretical framework and drawing from the case studies and the production of the final wordless book that leads this research. The illustrations for the book will be an assemblage of mixed methods as demonstrated here. Large A3 spreads crowded with characters and their unique stories, defined by repetition, unashamedly linear, chaotic but with a hidden system. The line, the loop, the spiral and the rhizome. Many thanks. The end. So I need to unshare here.
That's great, Tess, thank you so much. And again,
I managed it.
already respecting the time. There's so much there. It's very rich indeed, as the others were. And maybe we just need just a few seconds just to take stock a little bit and think. If there are any questions people have immediately, put their hand up virtually or in the chat, and then we can engage and discuss. Okay, so Judith, your hand is up. Hi, Judith.
Yeah, sorry. Did you want me to put it in the chat?
No, please speak it. Well, I'll do both, if you wish.
I had a question for Caroline. And thank you for your fascinating presentation, I mean, as they all were. But I just wanted to ask, what led you to focus on deer? Did you consider other animals, or did you sort of go straight for deer at the start? Because I'm never going to look at them in the same way again.
Well, deer kind of found me, I think. I was traveling a lot on the train. I'm based in Bath, and I was travelling on the train up to London to do my MA and then down to Cornwall to see my parents. And I just kept spotting deer. And then from that, it led to deer coming into a series of poems. And I decided I wanted to explore further during my PhD and develop that body of work. And actually, those poems sat around for a long time, but now have turned into a set of poetic tarot cards. So that's kind of another element. But I then found that there's a lot to explore with deer because they're on the cusp. Then they're neither tame nor totally wild. There's this very interesting flipping that goes on between, on the one hand, they can be seen as very cute, but then also as a pest. So, you know, I found articles like in the Daily Mail about, you know, oh, they may look cute, but they're destroying gardens and causing accidents and all of this. So, I mean, I know there are certain issues with perhaps, you know, if you're wanting to take an ecological perspective with looking at a particular species, but it has allowed me to kind of investigate quite a lot around deer that I wouldn't have been able to do if I was maybe looking at a sort of a broader habitat, for example.
Thank you.
Thank you, Judith and Caroline. I mean, I wonder if I can just ask a question, which perhaps is a more general question to all four presenters. And that is, I was struck by the way that negativity, although it wasn't called that, and it took different forms, whether it's violence of cutting up or whether it's a violent reaction like Woolf had to cinema, which I didn't really know. And that's very interesting in terms of Virginia Woolf's sort of profile. I mean, you know, she can be anti-Semitic, she can be anti-cinema. I mean, she can be lots of things that she's not really known for, or at least not celebrated for. And similarly, the case with Herring as well. I mean, that can be actually seen as from this perspective, a kind of generative move in the way that Polly was talking about it. And similar things going on in Tessa's presentation, where one can look at the linear, which one can see that perhaps as restricting, but the linear is never simply linear. It's always plurivocal and I suppose plurifolded, I want to say, but that's not quite the right word either. It's pluri anyway. And I just wondered if that was something that the presenters could maybe speak more about, how within the process, within the practice, whether it's theoretical or artistic practice, the movement of negativity is actually really important here. The cut up, there's images which seem, for example, in Caroline's practice as the result of something very violent, actually are about a reflection on cuteness, on delicacy, and therefore that's political. So I just, without wishing to collapse the presentations because they're all very distinctive and doing particular things, but I wonder if the presenters could maybe talk about that and how that perhaps has motivated them theoretically in their work. Whoever wants to start first, and please don't feel you have to either.
I don't mind starting.
Fine,
Okay.
great.
So yes, thank you for picking up on that, James. Yes, certainly. I think I've been very aware in my work of kind of the interplay of the violence done to deer. So Cut Out Bambi aims to highlight the fact that we can see deer as cute when it's like maybe a particular deer or a particular fawn, but actually they are killed in the hundreds of thousands, whether it's on the roads or by culling. So actually the act of violence in my poetic work of Cut Out Bambi aims to bring attention to that kind of cognitive dissonance, if you like, that humans hold in kind of attitudes towards deer. And then recognizing, yes, that this idea of taking apart and of remaking and reforming texts can be very generative. So as in kind of thinking around breaking the deer. And I've also done a translation of the deer hunt scene from Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which is partly kind of what brought me to the poem. And it's an absolute horrific massacre. Basically, it's presented in the poem as like a kind of a great triumph where so many deer were killed you could hardly believe it, but it's a tragedy if you look at it from the deer's perspective. And there I've kind of used the cuteness. I've done substitutions so that the letter R turns into or, AWW throughout, and I've taken out, erased the other letters of the word deer. And it's supposed to actually make the reader feel quite uncomfortable that they have this juxtaposition between the cuteness and the violence. So that's where I'm talking about using cuteness as critique.
Mm-hmm. There is a comment from Nicholas that the cognitive distancing applies also to lambs and rabbits, etc. In terms of the animal.
Yeah, just to say it's a well, lamb, perhaps deer particularly, because they're, I don't know, it's different with different animals because, as you said, deer are sort of semi-wild, but whereas lambs are domesticated, but they're cute and cuddly, but that it's part of a kind of culture of dissonance, which I don't know that it applies so much in other countries where they're, for better or worse, they're much less. There's less dissonance in places like Italy, for example, to some extent. I don't know whether so much anymore, but there there are no qualms. Dogs aren't kept as cuddly pets. They're kept because they can be used, and they have a consistent attitude about using animals, which, like it or not, it is more consistent than this rather hypocritical thing that we seem to have in England,
Yes, if I could come back on that, I totally agree. And it's partly a generational thing as well, and partly where, whether you're in an urban or rural environment, because, if you're on a working farm, it's quite different attitudes sometimes. But yeah, it always gets me when cute, cuddly animals are used to actually advertise their meat. So it's like, oh, fluffy chicken advertising eggs, or cute, cuddly lamb advertising lamb. So yeah. Totally. Thank you.
Teal.
Great. Thanks, everyone, for the talks. I think all four were absolutely fascinating and would be great to really delve into them in more depth. And I look forward to reading the final PhDs for all four of you. I have an observation and maybe a question off the back of that. I think all four of you are dealing with aspects of storytelling through your work. And I wonder if you could, maybe each of you just talk a little bit more about the artifact and what that artifact is and how the form of that artifact helps you tell that story. So what are the narratives that are being created through the form as well as the content?
I don't mind jumping in. Because it's integral to my research, because I'm moving between different forms, because I'm moving from moving image and then to the physical object of a book, and that's something that I'm reconciling with and struggling with to a degree. So it very much dictates my storytelling and approach to storytelling is that physical object and the limits of those objects, whether it's film strip, which I know doesn't exist anymore, but thinking about the, because I animate on paper, I do have big wadges of paper at home that I can think of, which sort of really, it's kind of like a forensic approach to storytelling, because time is slowed down as I work, and then returning to the book where it can move at a pace. So it's very, very important to me, certainly. But I don't know how that relates maybe to Polly's presentation, because I'm such a huge fan of silent films, so I was really excited to see to hear what you had to say about especially our relationship to silent film as contemporary audiences.
Oh, thank you, Tess. That means a lot. Thank you. And thanks for the both really interesting questions. I'm thinking a lot about the negativity and then also a lot about the idea of storytelling. And that's also something I was really keen to, really excited to see between all four of the talks there, actually. So thank you for bringing that up, Teal. Yeah, I think that storytelling is such, similar to Tess, it's such a big part of my research. It's quite complicated. My research looks at kind of telling or questioning the story around a critical movement. So the kind of working broadly in new modernist studies and looking at how we tell the stories of modernism, how we tell the stories of silent cinema, and how we tell the story of sound and how that came about. And looking at that by kind of going to the archives and reading these whether it's correspondence, whether it's primary text, whether it's fiction, like the book that I was discussing today. So it's kind of looking at storytelling in a kind of like meta sense, and then it's also looking at the story of someone's life. So Robert Herring was he's got no biography that stands, so it's been kind of trying to pick apart the story of his life and how that intersected with the Pool Group and the story that he told about cinema as well, and what that meant and how that enriches our idea of silent cinema and of the talkies and how that all works together. So it's lots of different kind of unraveling different stories about a story about something that happened in the 1920s, and it's very confusing. And I loved hearing kind of everyone's discussion around kind of whether it's the kind of spiral of the rhizome or whether it's the multiple voices in Amina's talk. I found that absolutely fascinating. I'm wondering whether I can ask a bit about the kind of multiple ideas of storytelling or multiple ideas of voices in your talk, Amina.
Yes, so actually I'll try and join all the questions together. So in my work, I found that actually voices in AI are not really understood as sound. They are understood more so through images. Voice gets sort of transferred into a waveform or a spectrogram image. They become static. And so then in my storytelling, I place the emphasis of the voice as being a sonic phenomenon, which can't really be captured or contained or made to be static or turned into this visual thing, because it is ephemeral and it does have a materiality that means that it then interacts with, you can probably tell that I'm in a small room right now and not a cathedral because of the way that my voice sounds, but all of that materiality gets stripped out of voices, and that's what kind of allows for them to be profiled in the ways that they are. And, you know, the negative impacts are huge ranging, especially to marginalized people and displaced people. There's a lot of AI vocal analysis that's used in border control and Laurence Abraham writes a lot about this, to determine where undocumented asylum seekers come from. You know, they will profile their voices and be like, oh, you're from Sudan, and just send people back to that country, which may not even be their country of origin, you know. So then there does become this multiplicity of voices when you treat it as a sonic phenomena that has materiality, because our voices are constantly changing through so many different factors. Yes, there are the biological factors, but there are also factors determined by, yes, where we are, who we're with. It's this kind of morphing thing. And then so if you then treat an individual's voice as multiple, it's a way to sort of then erode the rationale of these profiling practices. And I guess that sort of came to me through reading this literature, and then about all these crazy things that they think that they can profile about people, and just thinking, no, that's not, I don't think that's quite true, actually. You know, I'm a singer, and I sometimes sing in German, but I don't know how to speak German, but I can sort of make my voice sound as though it's, you know, it can be shaped by the body in all sorts of different ways. Yeah, I think I tried to answer 3 questions in one there.
Thank you, Amina. Can I just ask, just as a follow-up, because I was interested in the way that you chose, and you presented as such, as a female voice, a female vocal performance, which is incredible. And it seemed to be that was important, that it was a female performer. And I think, but please correct me if I'm wrong, you were suggesting that is perhaps what is going on more in female performance, the concentration on the voice, explorations of the voice, which was sort of tie in, if that's the case, to, in film studies, for example, the kind of championing of the voice, especially in 70s film theory, the acoustic mirror, Catcher Silverman, you know, it's the voice as opposed to something perceived as, you know, the image, masculine, because of narrative. We have something which is perhaps more open and uncharted and potential, which is voice. Now, things have moved on since then, but there was a moment when the voice was very important, and it was perceived as feminine. And I'm wondering if in the age of AI, therefore, it's a political choice to prioritize female vocal performance, which does still retain a sense of a body, of an identity, which is not being mangled, morphed by the machine. I just wondered if that was part of your discussion, or maybe I'm just projecting onto it from film studies.
No, yes, there definitely is that discussion there, and I didn't talk about it today, but my work encompasses both human and synthesized voices. I didn't have time to include the aspects, the practice more related to synthesized voices, but they do tend to be female voices, and so there is a kind of correlation to what you're saying, but also against that as well, because these synthesized voices are disembodied, and they are acousmatic, meaning that they have, you know, you can't locate their origin. They are without a body. And then there's also lots of literature around violence towards those female synthesized voices through the way people speak to them, but also in the way that they're portrayed as, you know, they're not giving very good representations of women, but at the same time they are projecting that they are supposed to be perceived as female. So there's a huge amount of discussion going on there about why these voices are feminine sounding. The companies say, oh, you know, it's not supposed to be male or female, but at the same time they also say things like, oh, through our research, female voices were found to be more caring and sympathetic, so people find them easier to ask them to do tasks. For example, male voices are too assertive. So there's a contradiction in also what the AI industry says and thinks. Yeah, does that answer your question? I'm not sure.
It's a difficult one, isn't it? I mean, there's so much here, but thank you for that. Caroline has a hand up, and perhaps I should just acknowledge the chat from Sylvie about cuteness, critique and violence seem to be captured quite nicely in this film. Bambi meets Godzilla, I haven't seen that, but thanks for the link, Sylvie, and also the term charismatic megafauna from Amina. Thank you, Amina. And Caroline.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, and thank you for those. I haven't seen Bambi meets Godzilla. I kind of feel I should. So yeah, the point I wanted to make, it kind of picks up slightly from what Teal was saying, and then also what you were just talking about, Amina. So in my work, thinking around forms, I kind of tend to work across a lot of different forms and kind of translate between them. So I made the deer collars in response to imagery and poetry and theory. They've then been transformed into being poems, and I've then also made them into other artworks. With Cutout Bambi, I created a soundtrack, the soundtrack to Cutout Bambi, which was a kind of a multi-layered vocal recording. And elsewhere I've kind of transcribed video, for example, and I've written pieces in response to video work and then embedded the QR codes in pamphlets, for example. So I tend to work across quite a few forms. And the way this links into what you were saying, Amina, which I think is so interesting, is as a performer, as a poetry reader, I'm really struggling with being, you know, female identifying with a female sounding voice and sounding and performing cuteness. So, you know, the Sir Gawain and the Green Knight translation I was talking about, with all the substitutions of or, you know, I find it really challenging to think about how to sound that. And I'm actually, there's a poet, Camilla Nelson, who's doing, in fact, a series of workshops about somatic poetics. And I'm going to go and try and play an experiment with that. But I wondered if you had come across, you did talk about some of the preconceptions about female voices and what's kind of layered on to female voices. But I wondered, yeah, if there was anything else around that and what you thought around, you know, trying to sound cuteness, for example, in a female voice.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm trying to think. I don't know. I would maybe just encourage you to think more like Cathy Barbarian and the other experimental vocal practitioners. I don't know why exactly they tend to be female. Well, I do a little bit, you know, the music and composition, those fields are so dominated by men, and Cathy Barbarian's way kind of went really against that. She was fed up of having to be like the opera singer and the diva and the you know, fulfill all these roles that were put onto her that perhaps she just didn't feel aligned to, and that's what motivated her to start using her voice in all these sort of weird and wonderful ways. So I don't know. Maybe there's just a way to think about your voice is not necessarily your own anyway. Nina Son Eichem writes about how it's sort of a collective learning, a collective pedagogy around the way our voices sound the way they do. It's not just biology. So it's not so tied to gender or sex. It is a kind of a learning through your community and things like that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amina. Are there any questions from perhaps from those who were not presenting? Okay, thank you, Nicholas. So Phil Minton, the only male experimental video artist who springs to mind. Okay, thank you.
Voice artist.
Yeah, thank you. I wonder if I can just make just an observation. So it's not really a question, but it was prompted by effectively a question that Tess was asking, just in terms of, you know, cinema, Bergson, and trains. And I mean, again, it's interesting. I mean, Bergson is you know, this giant philosopher who had these really ambivalent feelings about cinema. But I mean, I think it is recognized that cinema is part of that moment of cinema. And I would just say that, you know, if you were to look at Histoire du Cinéma, Stories, Histories of Cinema by Jean-Luc Godard, this 10-year project, I mean, that, which is in many ways an animation film, I mean, it's bringing in every type of image available, whether it's art images, animation, Disney, obviously archive material, and new recorded material. But I mean, you know, what he's saying all the time and what gives it the rhythm is that the birth of cinema is the birth of the train, and all those sort of ideas and metaphors that you were unraveling in terms of projection, in terms of the tracking and multi-tracking. I mean, Godard is also working with, it's obviously a very different sort of project from what you're doing, but there are some similarities there, I feel. Because it's the train, it's the train, and the train can deviate and backtrack and splinter and fork and go off into fascism and all sorts of things. It's a very particular sort of historiography, but there are connections, I think. I just make that observation.
If I may jump in just very quickly as well and expand on that, James. Yeah, really interesting. Tess, I'm sure you've read Laura Marcus's brilliant work on cinema and on trains and on movement and modernity. And yeah, James's comments just really made me think of that brilliant work. I can't quite remember the title of it now, but just how important and central trains are to that moment in time. So I don't know whether that's a part of your thesis.
Yeah, it's been written about so extensively. It's certainly not a new a new idea that I'm. It was just the obvious place to start. I think that was how I felt. But because I'm taking it into a different platform, if you like, with wordless picture books, then but actually there's a whole archive of discussion just with picture books and trains. So it's very much a genre in of itself, and it's seductive. It's incredibly seductive, and there's just some real ephemera written about it. I think Robert Eager said that every film with a train is filled with nuns and sailors. You know, these sort of strange, which I'm not sure is strictly the case, but I think he wrote that in the 90s. So it might be interesting to unpack that. But we all they as a genre, it encompasses romance, it encompasses thrillers, it encompasses, you know, sort of so many different areas. But it's the mechanics, I think, that I'm seduced by.
Okay, thank you, Tess. There is a question. Well, there's a hand up anyway from Nicholas.
Oh yeah, it's just briefly to plug Stan Brackage's film, The Wandering, which is a film shot from a train of the Third Avenue Elevated Railway in New York, and it's designed so that it can be projected the normal way around, backwards and flipped, and combinations of that. So it's just printed on double perforated stock so that it can be shown 3-4 different ways, yeah, in different orientations. And again, you know, so time goes backwards and forwards, and yeah, it's quite a nice film. That was all really.
Thank you, Nicholas. And thank you also for Polly for giving us the full title there of Laura Marcus's book. It's 6:30. Are there any other thoughts or questions? I have one, I confess, but I just wonder if a general one. I wonder if there are any further thoughts or questions from our virtual floor. Well, I'm going to ask the presenters, but perhaps everyone, because it's such a obviously a big deal, AI, and I don't want to bore everyone with, you know, AI, and it's a natural kind of question to ask, but I will anyway, just because I was struck again by how someone like Deleuze, for example, is important for your work, Tess, and how you think about the rhizome and movement, as it was in our first session. I mean, Deleuze was presented as in a very positive way, which kind of sort of surprising, because Deleuze, for many people, is so passé and so much of its moment, and we've moved on and so much more kind of smart and, you know, less idealistic than Deleuze. But obviously Deleuze is important, but that's a particular moment, just as the analog moment has passed in cinema. So now you, who are finishing PhDs, practice or theory, are in that moment of AI. I mean, suddenly it's kind of everywhere. We can't escape it, and we've got to deal with it. And clearly some of you are doing that directly. I just wonder whether you have any sort of thoughts on that. I mean, whether you can perhaps sort of package AI in a footnote and move on, or whether you feel you have to really kind of get to the rub of AI, whether that's something that is perhaps important to you, or maybe not. That's an open question. Which doesn't presuppose an answer, actually. But anyway.
Oh, so I thought Polly was going to jump in there because she leaned forward. So, I'd love to just package it up and put it in a box. I'd love to be able to do. And I suppose how it relates to Deleuze, who is so problematic, and who also, interestingly, wasn't interested in animation at all. So I'm quite comfortable with dipping in and out, if you like, philosophically with when it comes to my research. But that doesn't answer the question about AI. I suppose the jury's out, isn't it, in terms of how much it's going to inform specific to our research. I mean, Amina's is more directly concerned, so maybe she's better to answer that question. I imagine, what would Deleuze think of AI? What would Henri Bergson think of AI? I think it might come around, and actually Bergson would be in full support.
Yeah, I guess I should say something, but I'm not sure how to answer that. I guess you can tell from the tone of my presentation, I'm not the biggest AI fan. I don't also necessarily see it all as like completely evil. It's a bit more like we have this new tool, but we're not sure how to use it yet, and especially use it in a responsible way. Or even useful way. I don't know if it's even that useful. But I also think people shouldn't feel the need to have to address it if that's not like their work isn't concerned with that. I know it's huge at the moment, but AI does go through these peaks and troughs, these AI winters and AI hypes, and at the moment we're in a kind of hype phase, but there's no reason why it will kind of lose its intrigue again soon. I was actually at a conference last week, and Wesley Goatley gave a really good talk about AI and art, which hopefully he'll publish in some way soon. I also think, kind of another comment to make is, I don't know if like AI should just be grouped together as this one giant thing. Within it, there's so much going on, and a lot of it is actually more sort of machine learning rather than AI. And but that also gets very tangled, and it's not all the same. I don't know if it can all be like congealed into this one mass, I guess. Yeah.
You're right that it is important to differentiate, and that's already an act of resistance, it seems to me, rather than to make it a seamless AI moment. Thank you for that. Polly and Caroline, did you have any thoughts at all before we break?
After you, Caroline.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I suppose I'm kind of with some of the people who would say we have many current catastrophes, issues, climate catastrophe, biodiversity, emergency to deal with. So while it's important, very important to address AI and see what can be done now so that that doesn't, so that the negative aspects don't kind of come to the fore, there are many other things related to my work which are probably kind of more pertinent right now in terms of the lives of deer, for example. If we're kind of trying to look at a taking more account of non-human perspectives, non-human rights, if you like, and those relationships between and attitudes towards the other non-human persons on this planet. I would also say as well that I come from a book publishing background, and as we all know, the death of the book was kind of predicted quite a while back. But books and the tactility, the materiality of books has kind of continued to be, in fact, perhaps even more valued than it was before. So I think what might happen is that there will be, at the same time as the development of AI, there will be a revaluing of the things that are not AI and not machine learning and not digital at the same time. So I'm sure that it will affect and shape our cultures in many, many different ways that we can't predict yet.
That's really useful. Yeah, I don't know whether I've got anything more to add other than just to kind of echo and support like what's been said, especially about AI, but just maybe bringing it back to the 1920s and kind of my research interests. It's really helpful to kind of again think through this intense kind of like fear of, but also excitement around these things, and how, yeah, to echo Caroline's really thoughtful comments there, that it's more tangled up than we think, and nothing's kind of like cut off. There's not going to be, this is, yeah, it feels like a moment of AI, like Amina, you were saying, and James, like you said in your question, but perhaps it's, yeah, more tangled and more complicated than the moment suggests. I don't know whether that makes sense or answers your question, James.
Yeah, and absolutely, and it's a mediatized moment, isn't it? I mean, it's been around AI, but now suddenly it's a cause of fear and the world's going to end. I mean, it falls into all sorts of different tropes fostered by the media. So I take all that too. So thank you, Caroline and Polly. Some points that were made, Nicholas, there is a very good book on AI art by Martin Zellinger, Tactical Entanglement. Amina, Kate Crawford says AI is not artificial intelligence. There's a lot in that. And yes, and Teal is agreeing with Caroline to the rise of the hybrid book, playing with analog and digital interactivity. So maybe on the positive note of the hybrid then, and without trying to sort of demarcate and create more barriers and borders, perhaps we should end on a positive, and certainly the positive here is that this has been a wonderful collaboration. I want to thank the presenters, most obviously, for the incredible presentations and what you've made possible in terms of discussion. Also, our questions, and Teal for helping to get this up and running with Judith, whose idea it was initially. So thank you, Judith and Teal. As I said, I mean, there is a recording, or there will be a recording very shortly, and I'll put that on YouTube channel and contact the presenters for their approval. And once they've approved, then I can put it onto our YouTube channel and give everyone the link. So I think that is it for the moment, but in the strong hope that we can meet again for more discussion. And I will send everyone that attended today and also in the first session information about CVC events, so that I hope you'll join us. What will in fact be at the next session. This is our last event of the academic year. Okay, so thank you, Fabrizio, for your comment, and thanks everyone, and good luck with your research.
Thanks very much. That was brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you, Kish.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Okay.